We're back.
So you're a teacher, you're a professor. You're just talking about some of the ones who really inspired you over the years. How has teaching? I don't know if it's been spotty. I don't know if it's been like some teaching here and then sabbatical or that, if it's been straight teaching. But how does teaching? And man, you talking about those like the readings and being amongst other people who are so interested in literature, like just makes me miss academia so much more.
Yeah,
The idea being like you can these are people who are into the same things, but
right.
how has teaching informed your writing and vice versa?
Mm, um, you have to. Well, for me, I know when I come up with a lesson for a given class, I have to believe what I'm teaching, which I know
Do
like it
you
seems
though? Do you
obvious.
though? No.
But well, when I first started teaching, first of all, I was kind of terrified, and
Yeah.
first started teaching in when I first started grad school about I don't know 10 years ago now or
Hmm.
11 years ago, and when you first teach, you start to think, well, what have I learned, and how can I, in a sense, regurgitate that?
Right.
And of course, like the things, if it strikes you as something, if something you've learned strikes you as particularly useful to your own work, of course, like it makes sense that you teach that. But sometimes you just start leaning on things that you have been told. And
Hmm.
what I found what I found out pretty quickly, thankfully, is like if it doesn't actually make sense to me, then I can't teach it. I can't teach it well. It doesn't even sound true coming out of my mouth.
Oh yeah.
Like I can't even like fake it.
Yeah.
But beyond that, what I was starting to say is that sometimes a couple I started teaching a couple years go by, and sometimes what you even believe, like the concepts you came up with for yourself for your own writing, you start to question some of those things if you're paying
Hmm.
attention. And so teaching for me, like it keeps me really fresh in terms of what
Yeah.
I believe, because sometimes I'll pull up an old document and I'll be reading through as I'm preparing for a class, and I'm like, oh, like I really want to shift this and change this. And if I don't, like it's still like it doesn't, it doesn't come out right when I'm teaching. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, like you're repeating yourself and you're repeating what you believed, a year and a half ago, but you really need to update this because it's because you also learn as you write. And I think the teaching part really makes you articulate what you're learning as you're
Hmm.
creating stories and creating characters on the page. And so that's what I love about teaching. It kind of makes you, because sometimes you'll sit down and you write a draft of a story, and you do that over the course of who knows how long, maybe maybe a week, maybe a month, maybe a year. But you still may not be diagramming exactly like this is what I'm actually doing.
Okay.
And it's the teaching part that makes you go back and think, what was I actually doing? Some of it's going to be kind of flowing out of you semi subconsciously.
Hmm.
And teaching allows you to be more conscious with it and actually write down what it is you do, and you're able to, when you believe it, like when you understand, like, okay, yeah, that's what I did, that's how I accomplished this thing, now you can actually take that right back to the page
Mm.
and understand. At one point I was the title story, which is the story that closes out the book. It's the longest story, word count, page count wise,
Hmm.
and I was really stuck at a certain point in that story. I didn't really know how to move it forward, and I started like, now I know how I would approach such a thing, which is, one of the things I did. I listed out all my characters, and I thought, well, Chelani's my main character. He's the narrator of this final story. What's his dynamic between each of these other characters, and how many scenes do I have him in with each of these characters? Like, he can't just have one conversation with his mother, for example, and then she disappears. Like, it doesn't feel full. There's no arc
Uh-huh.
to that conversation. Um, and then obviously moving that forward with the more central conflict with his brother, and obviously with his father, and
Yeah.
being able to, in a sense, diagram those things and build those out, that was a strategy that I had to come up with, but now I remember that strategy to
Sure.
hopefully move forward to another story.
Huh. So you talk about like fresh, and that it kind of makes me think of like two things. One is like in knowing all these things and having the foundations, I mean, way more than the foundations, and having written this book and gotten through like plot issues and all that, like, is there like a danger in like overthinking it, like getting too like mechanical and losing like the, I don't know,
Mhm.
the visceral part of it, or the, and sorry, and then the second part of that would be kind of unrelated, but still this idea of fresh, who are you teaching, this idea, let's let our students know for sure, and you're obviously a publishing author as we speak, like, let our students know, like, writing wasn't just done in 1940s, like there are people writing, and there's a burgeoning, literary community. Like, who are you teaching / reading now that really excites you and inspires your own work, maybe? Sorry, I know that's a lot and they're kind of disparate questions, but I can remind you, in a second if you forget.
Yeah. Um, uh, Another great book that takes place in part in the Caribbean and Miami, Women of Salts, Gabriela Garcia,
Okay, yeah.
another currently Bay Area
Oh,
author.
that's right. Okay, nice.
That was a really great one to read, and I'm always trying to test my Miami in a sense
Mm.
against other people's view, just because I don't know, I could be delusional, I don't know. Like maybe I'm making all this stuff up, but it usually whenever I do it, it usually rings pretty true. um Pretty recently I read Morgan Talty's Night of the Living Res,
Woo,
which is a wonderful book. It's
man.
another one that's like mine. It's like, is this a story collection? Is it a novel?
Yep.
Hey, yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's one of my favorite reads of
Mhm.
the year. Beautiful language. I just love the way the book kind of moves between this younger version of this family, I'll say, or
Right.
the given character and the given protagonist. Uh, and I love really imperfect families, and this is
Uh-huh.
like clearly an imperfect family that's still worthy of our attention
Hmm.
as readers, and worthy of our bringing readers into this world so that we can learn about them. And yeah, I hope that book gets everything it deserves,
Hmm.
with attention. And uh I just started dipping into Sweet Soft Plenty Rhythm,
All
Laura
right.
Warhol's debut. um yeah, it's like I refuse to read people who have second books. I only read debut authors now.
That's it. That's it. That's it.
Now that I'm on team debut author. And I kind of just started it, but it's drawn me in really quickly. I love that a book that's about a musician
Hmm.
it's so lyrical already, and there's such rhythm. It would be really might be disappointed if that weren't the case, but it
Hmm.
does not disappoint at all.
All
It's
right.
like, I love that when you have musical prose, you're drawn in just so quickly, so much more quickly than I guess
Hmm.
other writing strengths, and
Sure.
this one has drawn me in just from the first sentence.
That's awesome.
Something I like to teach. I tend to teach books and stories that I've read multiple times. Uh, Who Will Greet You at Home is a story
I don't know
in
about that one.
what it means when a man falls from the sky by Leslie Neka Arima.
Oh, okay.
Um, and that's like this really wonderful, um, I guess, I don't know. I'm really bad at, like, is this surrealism? This is not surreal. It's like it's like folk. I don't know. Yeah, this is where I fall down
Genre
as
bending.
a
Genre
teacher.
bending.
It's
Yeah.
genre bending. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's about this world in which babies are created out of different materials, and um, they have to, you can create them out of paper, you can create them out of sticks and mud, you can create
Hmm.
them out of ceramic, gold, whatever materials you have on hand. And that kind of speaks to like these class differences and what kind of life these babies may be fated to have. But it's also about love, and the protagonist feeling like she never was worthy of love because of what she was made of, but
Oh.
she tries to make a baby out of materials that she sees as better than herself. And she really goes after what she wants in this way that there's lots of turns and pivots and moments of reversal and recognition, and it's a very teachable story,
Mm.
and really one of the more like creative things I've ever read.
Oh, yeah.
That I still feel capable of teaching. Sometimes I read things
Sure.
that are just so like, wow, that was creative. I love it. I don't know what to say about it, but I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, so
Okay.
anyway, that's some of what I'm reading.
Have you ever like felt like you kind of like jammed one down the student's throat, like you know, this is like this is a story that you love so much and they're just not having it?
For sure. For sure. Yeah, 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 yeah.
You don't have to
Yeah, I
name it
mean,
if you don't want to.
yeah, I wouldn't name the book
Yeah.
even if I did have it in mind. But yeah, yeah, that definitely happens. There's
Mm.
that's the thing that happens, and sometimes you try to draw like parallels from, I
Mm.
don't know, like movie trends or um music's the worst that you could ever try to do,
uh,
because anything that I know, my kids are like, "Oh, shut up, old man." Nobody listens to that
okay,
anymore.
boomer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
You know, there's a couple like memes and stuff where it's like you see somebody who's like staring intently at like, let's say, the boyfriend or girlfriend or wife, you know, and it's like, you know, when you're like, hey, you got to watch this movie, you got to watch this TV show, and you're like ready for them to laugh at the same part you laugh at.
Right, right,
You
right,
know what I
right.
mean? Like
Yeah,
that's us sometimes with the stories, right? Like you're gonna love
yeah,
this, and they're just like, let me experience it. And sometimes they don't
yeah.
love it as much as we do.
No,
That's
no,
all right
no.
though. That's all right though.
And what was the first part of your question?
Well, no, no problem. I don't even remember anymore. No, I'm just kidding. It
Okay.
was basically like, you know, the idea of like a, let's say like a coach or something in sports like gets starts watching video and he can't experience the sport as much anymore for its love. He's, you know, he's trying to break down everything.
Oh, yeah,
You know,
yeah,
so
yeah, yeah,
like as a
yeah,
writer, you know,
yeah.
knowing the mechanisms of it, like is there ever a time where you're almost like, dang it, I almost wish I could just be more free flowing, that it's too like stilted, I guess.
I think it's a reason why you haven't asked me this question, but everyone asked me this question, and so I've internalized the question. Why did you write stories and not a novel? And some people are like, you actually, I don't know if you know this, but you wrote a novel. Why do you keep calling it stories? But I think one reason that it turned out to be stories, or labeled as stories in the inner flap of the jacket,
Hmm.
is, once I figured out how to tell a story in one way, like I really didn't have much interest in going back and telling that story again in that kind of way. I
Hmm.
felt like I really wanted to teach myself how to write in second person long time,
Yeah.
in second person shorter time, for like thinking of the title story. I wanted to write first person, um, in a way that was way more like retrospective, like an older voice looking
Yes. Yes.
back on
Yes.
his
Yes.
childhood. And then I wanted to write a first person that was very close to the action, like in independent living. I wanted to, do my third person. So I
Hmm.
wanted to try all these things because not just because, well, yeah, I wanted to make sure I knew how to actually like work in these different modes, but also make sure that those modes kind of fit like what was going on in the
Hmm.
character's psychological or emotional state, or fitting the actual action of the story. But part of that is just I wanted to keep it fresh for myself,
Hmm.
um, and continue to experiment and teach myself how to write these stories. um, yeah, I think I do have that fear that, okay, I've got a thing figured out, so why would I ever do it again?
Hmm. Hmm. I'm having a little bit of a brain freeze on the publisher.
FSG, MCD,
Okay.
MCD, who's under Farrar, Straus, Giroux.
Right, 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 right. That was a was that a little bit of what's the word? Were you kind of like a lukewarm pronunciation there? Because I don't know how to pronounce it either, so I was hoping you were kind of like,
No.
sounds right to me. Yes.
I
Yeah.
think so. I think it's Giroux. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, just because I used to say something else, and then I was shocked when I heard it pronounced this way. I could be wrong. FSG.
Yeah, there you go. In the acknowledgments or the end notes, you write, I mean, sounds like the book, the collection, the thematically linked short stories, what was the term you used for it?
For my book?
Instead of thematically linked short stories, you use connected. There was a term you've been using, but you talk about maybe having written this book over like a couple decades even.
A decade.
A decade.
A decade. Yeah.
So I just love to know about like the continuity of the book and even like the order of the stories. There are what I want to say 8 stories. Eight stories. So I mean, like, the title story, like you said, is the last one.
Mhm.
They do fall in chronological order, I want to say. Maybe, there's flashbacks and flash forwards, but I guess just about like how important was story order
Mhm.
and how you put that together, and then just kind of like continuity where, you finished the book, what, 2020.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
You're
sold the book in 2021,
okay.
early-ish 2021 spring.
Okay.
And so that's when I call it done, just
Yeah.
because there was like a
Sure.
little bit of editing, working with
Mhm.
the editors after that. But truth be told, like I spent so long on the book that I went with the editors who weren't going to try to turn it into anything
Yeah.
else, because we had this big 14 publishing house
Okay.
auction set up, and I met
Yeah.
with all these teams, and everyone was so wonderful. And but and most weren't trying to turn it into anything else, but
Mhm.
every once in a while, there was an editor who would say, "Yeah, let's like really, really take our time and like turn this into a novel that's just like more cohesive." And it's like I respect that idea, and I do believe that also could have been a great book,
Mhm.
but it also kind of seemed like I already had a great book,
Yeah.
and so like maybe let's work together down the line, and I'll write this other novel. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But it kind of just seemed like why, like if we've already got a good thing, which I'm not saying they saw it as a good thing. I believe I already had like a really great book, and so I didn't want to mangle it for the sake
Yeah.
of mangling it, or putting someone else's stamp on it, just
Sure.
because I've worked with so many other professors who looked at this book, writers. Clearly it's done really great with reviews and all that. And
Mhm.
uh, what I loved about MCD FSG was they were kind of like, yeah, we'll put like these finishing touches on it, but we're not going to destroy your book.
Yeah.
And thankfully, what they promised was exactly what they did. And then
Mhm.
shout out to my UK editor as well. I'm with Fourth Estate, and the book's coming out in
Okay.
February next year in the UK and Commonwealth. And so my editor Kish, my editor Jackson, they worked together to give me just one document with both of their notes,
Mm.
and that was a really great to just spend time with their notes. But there were
Yeah.
no attempts to mangle my book, thankfully.
Yeah. That
And
makes
and so to answer your question,
no, you did.
well, over that time, I every time I wrote one story and then another, and that
Mhm.
second story really informed what I'd written before, and so I would go
Okay.
back and make sure those stories were in conversation, and so
Yeah.
that was really helpful.
Ooh, I love that idea of the stories themselves being conversation, that
Yeah.
personification, yeah, take on their
Hmm.
own lives.
Hmm.
The book is funny. It's hard to be funny on the page, right? Is it?
That's one I try not to think too hard about.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't know.
A lot of times it's a dark humor for sure.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I mean, there's some laugh out loud parts for sure. Um, so Trelawney is the narrator, right? I mean,
Mhm.
he's the through line of the book in many ways. The first
Right.
story is so informative, in informing the rest of them. It's
Mhm.
in second person. It's called In Flux. right? And it
Right.
starts off basically with like the question for a 8 or 9 year old or so, Trelawney, like, what are you, right?
Mhm.
From people at school, from people all over. What language is your mother speaking? Someone asks him.
Mhm.
Um, the narrator, according to his parents, speaks Yankees English. Is Yankee, like, is that a totally like neutral connotation in Jamaica, or is that kind of like a, like pocho or like whitewashed, or like, does it have a negative connotation attached to it? Or depending on who says it, I guess maybe.
I mean, it just means to Jamaicans, it just means American.
Mhm.
Well, I think in context, it is meant as a derogatory thing.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so
Yeah.
I don't
but
know.
Trelawney's speaking that, he's, the patriotism is drilled into him, and
Mhm.
he's spitting it back out, right? Asking, are we black? I think
Mhm.
even directly to his parents, who
Mhm.
are describing different family members, and talking about, even, Jamaica with this cultural mix, things about, fitting in at the new schools. There's a Jamaican group, there's a, the Puerto Rican or the Spanish speaking groups, the Black American groups, etc. And Trelawney writes about how he feels welcome in the library with the science fiction and conspiracies and such.
Right.
I
Right.
love to talk about the juxtaposition with him and his brother. Is it Delano or Delano?
Delano.
So Delano, I mean, there's definitely a juxtaposition set up. How is he like making his family proud at, especially in the younger day years, while Trelawney is not? Or is that too over? Am I oversimplifying that too much?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, he looks more like his father. He's the firstborn son who looks more like his father. He's inherited his father's blue eyes, which his father dreamed of passing on. That was the one thing he didn't want his wife Sonia to mess up.
Hmm.
But he's also got his favorite Topper. The father wanted his children to inherit Sonia, his wife's teeth.
Yeah, yeah, right.
And so Delano's got the best of both parents via through Topper's eyes and
Sure.
in Topper's eyes. And but he's also kind of athletic. He picks up music really quickly.
Mhm.
He is seemingly well liked by other children. Other children see him as a kind of leader. They want him to be the
Mhm.
quarterback for his team. Um, and he has seemed to retain his Jamaicanness in a sense, or
Mhm.
he's at least like finding an acceptable balance of retaining his Jamaican identity while growing up in the United States for the most part.
Mhm.
While Trelawney doesn't. He rejects the ackee. He thinks the ackee
Yes,
tastes
yes,
nasty
yes,
as a
yes.
kid. He is a bookish, quiet kid who doesn't appear to even necessarily understand what his father's saying, at
Mhm.
least from his father's point of view. Um, he is kind of someone who I think most of the men in the well in his family and speaking of Delano, speaking of Topper, they both have artistic
They do.
tendencies or desires. But Topper talking to his father told him, "You better not try to be a fashion designer. If you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
do it, but
yeah.
you can get the hell out of my house if you're going to do that.
Right.
You can work at my construction company." And I think he gets that message that I mean that's how he's able to provide for his family while they're in Jamaica, and then for a time he finds it hard to be a provider in the U.S., but he is able to build a business as a contractor, and so these like more traditionally masculine roles have kind of worked out more for Topper.
Mhm.
Um, in part because he's chosen not to pursue that love of design. Um, Meanwhile, while Delano, he does have his musical aspirations, he also has that kind of same entrepreneurial spirit where he does
Mhm.
a landscaping, tree service kind of job, and that's where Topper is willing to loan him money to start his own business.
Right.
meanwhile, Trelawney, with his artistic interest, is going off to college and wants to be a writer, and his father's not behind that, and he doesn't give him any money for his education. And I think he just sees him as this kind of strange kid that he doesn't quite understand. And even as Trelawney is trying to, after a while, after a time, he's trying to newly embrace his Jamaicanness,
Right.
that he was less interested in as a kid, back when he thought he could be like an ideal American boy. And then he comes to think, oh well, I'm not being treated as an ideal American boy. Maybe I can be an ideal Jamaican. And his father says, no, actually, you cannot be. And you don't know anything about Jamaica. And in fact, I find you. Well, he calls him a nasty name, and so there's this
starts with a B.
rift.
Well, before the one that starts with D, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Not a bad word, but in the context of it. But sorry to interrupt. But the word that starts with B, the 4-letter word, is that like a homophobic slur, basically? Butu?
Oh, no. No, that's like a classist.
Okay.
Yeah, that's like what you might call someone you see as low class.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, yeah. And so at one point he does seem to he says that he's acting like a Butsu,
right,
beforehand. And
sorry, I cut you off there, but you're like you talk about, there's such a sweep in that story, right? I mean, you talk about like there's so many excerpts from this book that could just work on their own. They're so awesome. They're so great. The one about like going deep on his Jamaican heritage, right? And it's like deep, like, this cultural illusion, deep like this music, deep like, some like Screw the Wayans Brothers, something like that. But and then of course going to that Midwest college where it's like, shifting racial identities. And I got to think, I mean, is it safe to say he feels like he's being treated like a trophy in many ways? Right.
Yeah, kind of exoticized in a way.
And that story ends with the DNA testing. He still doesn't have an answer to that question. I love the cyclical nature of that story just on its own, where it comes back to the same point. Who am I? What am I? Who am I in this world? And and seeing that DNA report and such. Second person, which is one like, I don't feel like that story could have been anything other than second person. But again, it's difficult. You know better than I. The second one is also second person. That's that's Topper the father's story. It's his rhythm, right? Under the Aki, is that how you pronounce it?
Correct. Under
the Aki tree, he writes about how uptown Kingston kid has options,
right?
And he kind of like through the 3 women who are maybe like possibilities for him. How did you get into the mindset of the father? Not just language wise, but like, being an older person and just in that kind of that flashback, and also doing that in second person. Where did that story come from in particular?
Yeah, I was thinking about Trelawney trying to get a hold of his identity, I guess, or his Jamaicanness, deciding, whether that's even a worthy goal to retain his Jamaicanness in the United States as the American born one and the son of Jamaicans. And what I came to realize is that when I was exploring that, that was not necessarily Trelawney's story to tell or to begin. And I wanted to actually explore, well, why did this family actually make that decision to leave Jamaica and come to the US? And I wanted to start the major tension in terms of the parents. One of the things that gets Trelawney in trouble is that his mother decides right when Trelawney is graduating college, she decides to leave the US. And so Trelawney no longer has that safety net of his mother, who probably wouldn't let a lot of the things that happen to him were she around. Topper, on the other hand, is this character who is not super willing to be that safety net for his son. And so I wanted to explore him because I didn't want him to be totally villainized in the book.
Yeah.
And something I wanted to explore, like with that opening line though, with if you're in Uptown Kingston, the son of Uptown Kingston,
Mm-hmm.
the only son, his options come from his class in a sense, and
Right.
you know there are lots of like interesting little things that I found difficult to convey to American readers.
Mm.
One of which is that not all Jamaicans live in shacks in the
Yeah.
ghetto.
Yeah.
Some people, there are lots of wealthy Jamaicans, there are lots of middle class Jamaicans. I wanted to explore that because even as this family comes into serious financial trouble
Mm-hmm.
in the US, they weren't in that situation when they're in Jamaica. They're actually
Mm-hmm.
pretty okay. His father owns a construction company. Like he was doing
Yeah.
well. Until there's this political turmoil that happens in the 1970s. And so what's happening in that story largely, I wanted him to start with all the options essentially
Mm.
and move him towards the US and move him forward in age and move him along this line of limited,
Right.
increasingly limited options. And when he says this thing to Trelawney, Trelawney says something hurtful to him, which is that you made a horrible decision leaving Jamaica, like shame on you. You effed
Mm.
everything up.
Mm-hmm.
And so he responds in a very hurtful way. And then Trelawney responds with a physical action that,
Yes.
serves to attempt to put a final end to some of the possibilities of moving Topper's legacy forward in the
Mm.
United States. And that was kind of the thinking, moving from lots of options to very few, uh,
Right.
while exploring this middle class Jamaican, also like middle class. Um, you could say light skinned, you could say multi gen mixed, however you want to put it. Jamaican who had a lot of privilege where he's coming from, and
Mm.
um, has to kind of fight his way back up into the middle class in the US, and kind
Right.
of gets there, but at a heavy cost.
Definitely. I was really struck by the idea of you know, of Topper oftentimes saying things like, hey, you don't want to go to Jamaica. You don't know about Jamaica. You don't know about the violence. You don't know about this and that, but also defending it and also putting it down.
Yeah.
And I know that goes across all immigrant groups, all groups of people, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Wherever home is, like, I know it better than you do, but I love it. And I hate it. All the above.
Right. Right.
So like you said, it wasn't, you don't just paint them with one brush kind of thing. You give them a head
Yeah,
story.
yeah, exactly. And kind of saying, Trelawney, like, why aren't you more Jamaican? But also, you could never be
Yes,
Jamaican.
exactly. That's exactly,
I don't like
exactly.
you because you're not Jamaican enough, but
Damned if
also,
you do,
like,
damned if you don't. Yeah.
right, there's nothing you could do to actually make yourself Jamaican enough. So,
Right.
right, exactly. And I love painting these kind of, or exploring anyway, like these
Mm,
really impossible
right.
dynamics. Because I think we as human beings like want to believe there's an answer
Hmm.
to every problem, and that's my worldview, is that there is not a good answer.
Exactly.
There's not a good answer for every problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the scene where he goes back, he had a baby with Jody, right?
Yeah.
In Jamaica, and that scene, you talk a lot about class. I mean,
Hmm.
he seems to be shocked by the poverty, right, that she's
Yeah.
living
Yeah.
in,
Right.
and he's basically like, was it basically like the baby was sleeping, and he was just like, all right, peace out,
Well,
like, or I don't
uh,
know how much you want to say about that.
yeah.
The phrasing was dead to life or dead to the world, some of that, but I was like, is he sleeping
uh, he says she's been dead from time. So
from time?
yes, and that's like a Jamaican thing we
I thought
say.
so. Okay.
Yeah, spoiler alert.
Yeah.
So the baby does not survive this poverty,
Oh no.
that uh he himself, like, he couldn't even really imagine that people are living in such poverty. And
Right.
for listeners, Jody is she was what they call in Jamaica a helper. Like they avoid
Mm.
the word maid,
Oh, okay.
basically, or but the helper can do a lot of things. Sometimes your helper is more of a cook. Sometimes they're
Mm,
more of a cleaner. Sometimes they look after the kids. Usually that's kind of negotiated, one-on-one. And so Jody was the family helper when they lived in Jamaica. And there's this one-time affair that takes place, and he never really considered, where she was coming from, and like the
mhm.
as much economic precarity as this family faces, like Jody was born into much worse,
Right.
and so he has to kind of, at least face that for a short time.
Well, for sure, there's definitely a theme that goes through the book of like father-son relationships or father-children relationships, which, duh, I
Mhm.
mean, it's kind of a generic term, but, you talk about the way that he dealt with, it is a daughter, right? A daughter in Jamaica, not a son.
Sorry, say that again.
So Jody had a daughter, right? Not a son.
It was a son. It
Yeah,
was a
okay,
boy.
excuse me. Yeah, so the way, in a later story called Splashdown, this is it pronounced Cookie?
Yeah. Mhm.
Cookie, the cousin, right? And it's
Yeah.
about him and his relationship with his father, who's pretty much, who's not around, who left the family, who left his wife, the mother, early. But I see those comparisons between, like, I was just struck by how Ox, the father, was just so, like, callous, but that's not even the word. Just like, cool. What's up, son? When his son comes to find him, how's it going? Right? He's never really too upset when he leaves. He's never too happy. He's not upset. He's not mad. He's
Mm.
kind of like, oh, cool. He's here when he's here. And, and I won't give away too much of that story. That story is an incredible, journey, the splashdown, but just, obviously father-son relationships, the ending of that story. Whoa, whoa. But just like, of course, we talked a little bit about, Trelawney and the way he deals with his father. His father thinks he's soft, he's Americanized, he's
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on there. And then of course with Delano. Um, there's also, the idea of questionable business ethics or practices, right? um,
Yeah, which one? Yeah,
right.
all over the place.
All the
Yeah.
above, like
Right.
independent
Absolutely.
living is, kind of midway through. How old is Trelawney, let's say, in independent living, like Muscle Meadows, like 25, 30, 25?
About getting up to closer to 30, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so I mean, the beginning of that story is just like, whoa, puts you into it. It's quote, if you ask me what do you do for a living, I might admit I hunt elderly people. I wrangle them, force them into stiff, scratchy chairs before interrogating them. I get out of them whether they have a job or a niece who sends them checks every month, etc. He's fallen on hard times after he got basically kicked out by his dad,
Mhm.
and he's doing some things that are morally shady to say the least, but it's
Mhm.
also like how much of it is survival.
Right.
But he's basically like, right, I mean, it's kind of, there's even when an older person dies and this, independent living for seniors, it's like, okay, who's next? Right. You got to
Right.
keep the money flowing through because his job,
Right.
maybe on the chopping block. So,
Right.
Ox, and some of the things he does with his like trapping of crabs and the business, all of that. And then even, Delano, when he has his own business,
Mhm.
the shadiness of it is, did you see this as